All right. In the last video, we talked about the beginnings of starting our website with the HTML5 templates, also how to deal with tags like p tags, paragraphs, h's, h2, h3s, etc. Now we're going to talk a little bit about divs and how those work and what they're for and the different types of divs. So I'm going to go ahead and close out of, if you're not already closed out of your practice there, your review practice there, we're going to open up a brand new HTML5 templates RWD, and we're going to double click on that one, and we'll create, this will be called div practice. Now, when I talk about divs, they're dividers or divisions. They're basically boxes, is really kind of all that they are. And there are a couple of different types of divs. We'll talk about those here in a minute. But let's just talk about divs in the generic sense. So let's say that I've got, let's say, an image and a paragraph in a particular arrangement that I like, and I need to create a more complex layout with these elements. What I can do is I can create a div around these elements that houses these elements. I'll color my divs green here, in order to kind of group them. It's almost like a group in Illustrator. So if a div is just a box, and what can go inside of a div? Images, paragraphs, other divs can also go inside of divs as well to make a more complex layout. So let's say I've got this div with this image and paragraph in there. I can then take that div with that image and paragraph, and let's say I needed to create more of a list of these items. And by putting them in divs, I can kind of deal with each one of these things as kind of a grouped element, and then rearrange them. In this case, I'm floating two divs next to each other, or if I needed them to go just one right after each other, this is their kind of their natural habitat, is just kind of going underneath each other. They don't go on side by side unless you float them, and we'll talk about floating here in just a little bit. But there are different types of divs that you can use. So some of the different types of divs that we'll talk about, I'm going to go ahead and open up my div practice, my index, and my style sheet here. I'll open those up in brackets. So we can just talk about the tags here a little bit. So there's a couple of different types of divs. There's the generic div, and they also have a closed div. Inside of that div, again, I can have an image I'll tag in there. A couple of paragraphs, let's say, or an H1 in there. So I might be able to put a couple of things in there. You don't have to feel like you have to put each individual item in their own individual div to deal with each other. Divs are great for sectioning off multiple things at a time. So, what other kinds of divs are there? There are other div tags that you can use. So, another div tag that you can use, and whenever I talk about divs, I talk about them in the generic sense of a box that you put stuff inside of, and then move that box around to make your layout. But there are different types of divs. So one of them is called a header. So you can have a header div. You can also have a footer div as well. You can have an article, which is where most of your content goes inside of article divs. You can have an aside div, and that kind of is associated with articles as well. You don't use them too much, but you, I'm sorry, there's one S in there, not aside. And then you have navs divs as well. And then you have, lastly, you have section divs. And I'll kind of I'm going to show you just a real quick look at when you might use each one of those types of divs. So div is for generic. I usually use that for a wrapper div, something, a container that my whole website lives inside of. Headers are generally for the tops of your site, footers for the bottom of your site, things that are often the similar between page to page. If you say that that's a header, that's probably going to be something that's repeated over and over again. An article is what you use generally for your main content bits, your main content boxes. Asides are associated with the articles. And we'll show you here an example of one in a second. A nav is, again, of course, holding your navigation, and often you'll find navs inside of headers. You might also find another type of nav inside of a footer if you have a footer nav, for instance. And then a section can be used to denote large chunks of a site. And I'll show you some examples of when you might use section for that structure there. So let's. I'm going to flip over to Illustrator real quick, and we'll take a look at when you might use these different types of divs. So here's an example of a general website that's looking pretty good here. It's a nice layout in general. So let's kind of pick this apart a little bit. And so what you'll find is there's not a true right or wrong answer of when you would use an article versus a header versus a footer versus an aside. The div police will not get you if you don't use the right one. But what they really are used for is to help Google kind of figure out what content is inside of it. So I would not put, for instance, these things as nav, because Google would kind of get confused. This is really a nav. This is really a good use for a nav div. So I'm just going to kind of section this off a little bit so you guys can kind of see it. And I'm just going to use some squares here. So I would call this right here, this whole thing right here, that is kind of, oops, let's try this again. That I would call a header. So that's going to be kind of your header here. Then this inside of your header, that would definitely be a nav div. Put that there. I'll put this here. That's definitely a nav because there's navigation in there. Now, as far as footer goes, if I go down here, definitely this would be, if I can move the right thing, this would definitely be a footer. It's something that is always going to be down at the chunk at the bottom of your site. As far as the rest of this site is concerned, I would probably do this with mostly articles. So let's do this one. This one would definitely be an article of some sort. These guys would definitely be articles as well. Those would definitely be articles as well. These guys as well. So most of this site would be made up of articles in some form or fashion. All articles. Just to show you a little bit of a difference there with, let's say, a section, or so sections are really easy to kind of see in banded sites, sites that have big chunky bands in them, like this one does. So I might call this one a section here. As well as this one I would call a section And then this one I would call a section as well. Just kind of these bands would be my section. But then I would actually have articles inside my section, or I might have a nav inside my section. So this would definitely be a nav div as well. And something like this would be an article because it's content. So I like to call my article, my contents are generally articles. But again, this would be an article here, article, 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 all four of these would be an article. This would be an article here because this is kind of in, one big band with multiple articles inside of that. This would be a footer of some sort. So that's kind of the way that a section might work for you. Now I could probably use a section back here. You could call this whole thing a section here if you wanted to. It's not totally necessary, but you can if you want to. And I use sections for most of the banded sites, to be honest with you. And then the aside is kind of a weird one. I liken it to be more for editorial websites where you have, let's say, an article in a magazine. I don't know if you've ever read a magazine and you're staying with our shoe concept here. You'll see an article about running or something along those lines. And then you'll see a little sidebar on one of the pages that has to do with like foot care or something along those lines. It's not part of the main article, but it is an accessory to that article from a subject standpoint. That's where an article and aside comes from, is that editorial kind of look. So you might say that this might be an article, for instance, and then these guys might be articles here. That's an article there. And these guys might be articles as well. I can just grab the same thing, right thing. There we go. So those might be articles. And then this guy, since it's kind of a sidebar and it's kind of related to some of the stuff that's going on, maybe like secondary articles or something like that, I might call this one an aside and use that aside div for this guy here. And call that one an aside because it kind of goes along with other articles here in this particular layout. But again, there's not any kind of like, you've got to do it this way, otherwise it's completely 100% wrong. It's more of a what does it make sense and what might it make sense to Google with helping you organize your information and organize your layout a little bit better. All right. So let's go back to our layout here and just talk a little bit about what you can do with divs. So I'm going to delete this stuff out here and just kind of start us over with a fresh slate. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to do just a really, really simple 3-div layout. And we'll talk about a couple of things with the next exercise where we get into a little bit more complicated stuff, but putting in images and putting in text and images together. But for right now, we're just going to make us 3 articles. So I'm going to make an article, and actually I'm going to back up one. I always like to start a new website with a wrapper div, and this is a wrapper. This wrapper div kind of gives structure to what the full website is. So I'm going to back up, and I'm just going to actually make a generic div with a class of wrapper. And we haven't talked about classes, or we haven't refreshed our memory on classes yet, but we'll talk about that in just a second. So I'm going to give that div a class of wrapper. And then I'm going to give, inside of wrapper, I'm going to put my 3 articles. So article, and I'll put a paragraph inside of article. So this is article 1. And then I'm going to make my other 2 articles exactly the same underneath here. Article 2, article 3. And so what I'm doing here is, notice a couple of things with my coding structure here. I'm doing indents. I'm making sure that when something is inside of something else, I've indented. And so this paragraph is inside of this article, this paragraph is inside of this article. So I want to make sure that these articles are all inside of my wrapper physically. So when I look at my code, I can really tell where things start and where things stop. And that's super important. Okay, so we've just kind of made these 3 articles. And an article by itself, will just kind of go underneath each other as a block. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you guys kind of what this looks like just by adding a little color. And I like to, when I'm doing a layout, especially when I'm doing a layout for the first time or I'm trying to block something out, I always put I colorize my divs because they're see-through by default. So I'm just going to put a little color in here so you guys can see what I'm doing. So I'm going to go to my style sheet and I'm going to start styling these guys. Now, my wrapper, I kind of want to give some dimension to my wrapper so you guys can see a little bit. And it is a class. So I need to talk to it. I could talk to it as a generic div if I wanted to, because it's the only div in my site so far. But I might have other generic divs that I want to talk to. So I'm actually going to give this a class. I did. And I'm going to talk to it as a class. So you talk to classes by hitting the period and writing the name of the class. No funky characters, no spaces, no capitals in your classes. Otherwise, you might have some screw-ups on there. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to give this guy a background color so we can kind of see it of red, just so we can kind of see it a little bit. Yeah. Gray. Let's make it gray. Let's go with this gigantic red thing. All right, so I'm going to save that and just take a look real quick. And again, I'm going down to Div Practice, I'm moving into Google Chrome, and I can see my wrapper has no dimension on it or anything like that, so it just goes a full width of my screen. That's fine for right now. We'll make some more modifications to this in our first exercise. And then you'll see Article 1, 2, and 3. Those don't have any kind of, you can't really see the bounding boxes of boundaries of these boxes. So let's see if we can see those just a little bit. So I'm going to go into brackets again, and I'm going to talk to all my articles because I'm going to make them all the same. And if you remember, if you just want to talk to a tag and you want to make all the tags the same, you can just talk to an article like an article. Each one does not have its own class. I'll show you how to make. I'll show you how to do that here in a second. If you wanted to make, say, some minor change to each article in some way. So let's say that we want to give ourselves a little bit of margin around our article, a little bit. So let's do a little bit of margin. And if you remember in the last one, we did it out longhand. Margin top, margin bottom, margin left, and margin right. I'm going to show you a shorthand here a little bit. So what we're going to do is I'm going to show you a shorthand. And whichever one you do is fine. You can write it out margin top, margin bottom, margin left, margin right if you want to, or you can use this shortcut. And it goes in clockwise fashion. So let's say that I wanted a margin left of margin top, I'm sorry. So it starts with the top. So margin top of, let's say, 2 rem. And then I say I want a margin right of 2.5%. We'll keep with our kind of our structure that we had, spacing structure that we had in that last video. And then let's say I want my bottom to be 2 rem. And I want my left to be 2.5%. So top and bottom in rims, right and left in percents. And then I'm going to give these guys a background color of red. And those guys, so let's see what that turned out to be. So I can see that I've got my div here with my articles inside. Now it moved my gray div down, and that's a problem with my wrapper here. Often when you put margins on the first thing, it can sometimes move things around on you that you don't want. So there's a little trick here. Whenever that happens, there's a little special thing that we'll run into over and over and over again. That's called overflow hidden. You'll put that on a parent div if something like that, crazy like that, happens where it's getting affected by margins inside of its div. Just kind of ignore that for right now, or just kind of gloss over that. Put that overflow hidden. We will run into that most certainly in the next project here when we go into it a little bit more depth. But you can kind of see that I've got my 3 divs here inside of my wrapper div with some margin around them, left, right, top, and bottom. Now, let's say, for instance, I wanted to give some dimension to my divs. Let's say I wanted Article 1 and Article 2 to be, let's say, a different size than Article 3, or vice versa. Maybe 1 is the top one, and then Article 2 and 3 are maybe smaller and maybe side by side or something along those lines. I can do that by putting classes on them. So let's say they're an article first, so I want to keep my margins and I want to keep my background color and all that stuff. But let's say I kind of want to change something about some of those other articles. What I can do is I can put a class on these guys, and I can say, hey, article, this article here and this article here, I'm going to make you a little different from, let's say, that article. I can put a class on it. So class equals, and I can name this class whatever I want to. I'll call this columns, because I'm gonna make these guys go side by side next to each other. So I'm going to do article class of columns. I'm also going to call this one an article class of columns as well. The nice thing about classes are if they're going to be the same, if you're going to change 2 things in the same exact way from a style perspective, you can use that class as many times as you want to. So I'm going to make article class of columns like this. So again, whenever you're talking to a class, you put a period in front of the word. Whenever you're talking to just a generic article, div, whatever, just a tag itself, you don't put the period in front of it. And we'll get more practice with that later on. So let's say I want my divs to be a different width. So right now, I don't really have any width on my article. And so they're going as large as they can with these margins. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give these guys a width. Let's say I need to do some math, because 50% will be more than I can handle with 2 of them side by side. So I might need to do a little bit of math here. So I've got Article 2 and Article 3 are 50% width, whereas Article 1 has no width on it, so it's going 100%. Or if I wanted to, I could put a width of 100% on it as well. So you can see that those 2 are affected by the class that I put on there. Maybe also I want to change the background color as well. I can. So it's still an article. It still has my margins on it that I wanted, that the original article had on there. But there's some things that I'm overriding when I want to. I can override width. I can override the color. I can override a lot of other things. So when we get on to the next practice, we're going to actually do an exercise These two were just kind of to talk you through things and kind of refresh your memory on things like divs and classes and paragraphs and things like that. The next thing we're going to do is we're actually going to do exercise 1, and that will be an actual mini site that we're going to build using all of these items plus a few more little tricks. So that's to be next.